Hi, my name's Ash.
And I'm Callie.
And welcome to Paved with Gold, the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast. I would like to acknowledge the traditional landowners on which Callie and I are recording and extend the same respect to the traditional custodians of the lands of which you are all listening. Callie, I am so excited for this episode. I have been waiting for this episode since we even floated the idea of starting this podcast together.
Yeah.
I'm so excited.
I know you are. And I'm excited because you're so excited. I was saying to you just before that when somebody is really passionate about something and very excited about something, it is my favorite thing to listen to. Like, talk to me an hour about a potato, and if you're excited about it, I'm excited for you.
Honestly, it's a very odd thing for me to be excited about, but today we are talking about the Minnesota Starvation Study. So I first started getting into this topic when I was in treatment. So I think I mentioned on one episode that I was very, I'm a creative person, and I live in this sort of world where there's no right or wrong answer, but I really take a lot of comfort in facts and understanding why I'm going through certain things. So when I found this study about the human effects of starvation on humans, it actually made so much more sense. And it was like, oh, so that's why I'm feeling this way and all that kind of stuff.
Anyway. You can't argue with fact.
Science is amazing.
Some people will try to.
Oh, there are plenty. This is going to be a big episode, so big that is going to be a two-parter, which is our very first two-parter.
We've made it. We've made it in the podcast world.
I haven't even finished part 2 yet, and I'm already at 17 pages of notes. So we'll keep the bants to a minimum.
Oh, God, okay.
First off, Callie, tell me what you know about the Minnesota Starvation Study.
Yes, probably not as much as you, even nearly, it sounds like. Not
you're about to
learn. To be honest. Yeah, I'm excited to learn it all. No, I guess it's a very base level knowledge, right, of a bunch of white dudes being...
Yep.
Can I say that?
Oh, you can say that because we're going to go into it.
A bunch of very average... normal-ish white dudes being put together and starved, put on a low-calorie diet. I believe it was like 1,500 calories, which is very interesting to me.
Stop spoiling the episode.
Sorry. You asked for my knowledge.
I did ask.
And just basically the ethical experiment that they did on them of the effects of what that 1,500 calorie diet did to them both physically and mentally. That's probably and I think it informs a lot of research now, because obviously you can't do that again.
No. And again, I'll get into that in part 2 for sure.
Yeah.
But yes, you definitely can't do this again.
Although it's interesting that you say it's we can't do that again. However, we look at society and how much, what kind of diets we're recommending to society. And I don't want to get into that because I feel like you're going to talk to me about that. But yeah.
I'm gonna talk to you about that.
Yeah, like it's unethical, but as a society, it's okay.
But you can buy this thing that does even worse.
Yeah, right. Fast for 3 days. It's fine.
It's fine.
I'm excited.
So before we begin, I tried to think of the broadest trigger warning that I can give this episode. It's got it all. Okay. So this is a human experiment from the 1940s. And like you said, is deemed very unethical by today's standards, as it involved exposing healthy humans to starvation. So if this is going to be too much for you, please do not feel compelled to listen. This episode will contain some talk of weight and calories. It will be talked about when absolutely necessary, and purely in a scientific descriptive capacity. I hate referencing any sort of weights, calories, or numbers, but I did feel that I would be doing a disservice to the topic if I didn't include that. So please proceed with discretion. Also, it is the 1940s and 50s, so there are some racial undertones might come up, as we have talked about.
It would be sprinkled with some spicy, messed up shit.
Yeah. Also, if anyone knows the background of the scientist Ansel Keys who conducted this study, it should come as no surprise that there is some fat phobia and anti-fat bias baked into this study. And it may be touched on throughout this episode, but again, I've kept most of that to a minimum because, we'll get there. There is one incident of self-harm that will be touched on briefly in the second part. So you don't need to worry about that now, but I will give you warning before I mention it. Mm-hmm. And then finally, given the time period that this study took place, being in World War II, there may be some reference to wartime events and, the Nazi regime, which are purely touched on for a time and place context. But I'm putting that out there for anyone who may be particularly affected by those topics. So I guess you might be wondering why I even wanted to cover this topic, given that it is so controversial and unethical. But I think the reason this study is so important and is referenced so often, as you mentioned, Cals, is that it is one of the only studies that exists on physiological and psychological effects of starvation on the human body. It will likely and never should be repeated for obvious reasons that I will touch on more later. And it is also one of the core data sets that helps us distinguish between the effects of starvations and the symptoms of restrictive eating disorders, such as anorexia, but pretty much just, other eating disorders, behavioral effects that those can have. Which is why I think it's important that we talk about it, and why I think I find it, as I mentioned, such a fascinating topic, while obviously acknowledging its criticisms and scientific shortcomings.
Yeah.
I will try and touch on the triggering topics as lightly as possible. However, if this is something that you are not feeling up to right now, please use your own discretion, and we completely understand if you just want to go ahead and skip this one. Totally fine. Do not blame you. We'll see you on the next one.
Yeah. Protect your peace.
Now that that's all been said, for those who are still here.
Hello.
Hi, let's get going. So the main source I used for this episode was a book by Todd Tucker, and it's called The Great Starvation Experiment, Ansel Keys and the Men Who Starved for Science. It is a great summary of the academic paper that Keys ended up publishing as a result of this study. And he also interviewed a lot of the study participants before many of them passed away. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. And he also touched on a follow-up paper on the study that was released in 2005. So if you're interested in reading more about the study and go beyond this, I highly recommend picking up that read. It is a very, very interesting little summary.
Yeah. Okay.
I'll link the name in the description below. So the Minnesota Starvation Study was conducted by a man called Dr. Ansel Keys. If you have any background into the history of nutrition or have listened or have any interest in this space, this name should be familiar to you. Ansel Keys was, as you can probably guess, a public health scientist and physiologist at the University of Minnesota. He was responsible for a whole bunch of nutrition research. He was the first to suggest and research the correlation between cholesterol levels and cardiovascular disease, which of course has been heavily debated even now. So it's very interesting to see how a lot of that is being reinvestigated now. You can blame him for the popularity of the low-fat diet, so thanks, mate. That was nice
I love
of you.
him.
Yay. He was the first to promote the health benefits of the Mediterranean diet.
Okay. All right.
And he is also responsible for the popularization of the BMI as a tool to predict body fat, which, as we know, is not a great tool at all.
And I think you can listen to a maintenance phase episode on the BMI.
You absolutely can.
Yeah, if you don't have a good I think most people have a bit of a BMI is trash. But if you want a really good deep dive, there's a good episode.
And realize how trash.
Yeah. Deepen your understanding of the trash.
Exactly. Yes, there are far smarter people who can debunk the BMI more succinctly. So we won't get into that here because we will be here all day. Just the last little bio thing I'll rattle off about him is he conducted a whole bunch of studies for the military during World War II. And he actually developed, he was responsible for developing the war rations known as the K ration.
Ah.
Yeah, which was he figured out how many calories and how much energy and nutrition had to be carried around by soldiers.
Interesting.
Yeah, during wartime, so that they could be well fed and nourished while they were completing military service. Yeah,
Interesting.
so yeah, he did some good. He conducted a whole bunch of tests on nutrient deficiencies, the effect on bed rest, the effects of thirst, as well as the effects of extreme temperatures and extensive moisture on the body.
Right. Okay.
He made the cover of Time magazine for his contributions to dietary science, but the too long didn't read on this guy is he was a big deal of his time, and he still is considered a pioneer in nutritional science. So obviously the counterpoint of Ansel Keys is he has said some pretty horrific things about fat people, and his research has a pretty specific skew when it comes to race and gender. But I'm not here to talk about why Ansel Keys is problematic. I acknowledge that he is, but I'm here to look at the study as it is, in the context it was performed, and the results it presented.
Cool.
So, Ash, shut up and let's get into why we're all listening now that we're like 10 minutes in.
Tell me more.
So let's first look at the context of this study and what led to the study's inception. So at the time that Keys got the idea for this study, it was the 1940s. World War II was gripping the globe and famine was raging across the world, as was hunger and starvation. Over the centuries, people had recorded anecdotal reports of the effects of famine and starvation, but there was little in the scientific literature that described its physiological and psychological effects. So just as important, doctors and researchers didn't know how to help people rehabilitate and recover from starvation. Enter Ansel Keys. As I mentioned before, Keys did a whole bunch of studies during the wartime period, and all of these tests were done on humans, human guinea pigs. All of these volunteers, quote unquote, were all conscientious objectors, which I got the exact definition. I was
going to say, what is that?
Which is defined by Queensland Health as a person who declines to participate in a lawful process or procedure due to their personal beliefs, values, or moral concerns. So in December 1941, the US entered the war after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and it was from this point that there was military conscription for men between the ages of 18 and 64 years old. So for this context, our conscientious objectors were a bunch of men who refused to perform military service during World War II based on their personal views or beliefs. In retrospect, seems totally fair.
I mean, could you imagine?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So many conscientious objectors, or what I will now be referring to as COs for the interest of time, they were required to take part in some role if they were abstaining from military service. So they couldn't just like have a little holiday. They had to actually do work. So it would be non-combat roles such as medics or chaplains. Others simply went to jail. Many volunteered for the civilian public service, which is what I will now be referring to as the CPS. Not to be confused with Child Protective Services.
I was going to say that.
No, when you hear CPS, it's talking about the civilian public service. And this body was, to put plainly, the government's way of dealing with all those pesky pacifists.
How dare they?
I know. The CPS had the COs doing things such as soil conservation, firefighting, forestry, agricultural, working in mental institutions, which that is a direct, that's their term, not mine. And also as subjects for medical research. All of this was, of course, unpaid. So this is where Dr. Keys got so many of his quote-unquote volunteers for his studies.
Oh my God.
So, of course, I'm using the term volunteer loosely because while many of these men did respond to the recruitment call for this particular study, one could argue just how much of a volunteer you could be at the CPS, given that, you can go to jail or you can starve yourself.
I was going to say, what's the alternative here?
Exactly. So, grain of salt, I'm using the term volunteer very loosely. So, the year is 1943. And Ansel Keys puts out a call for volunteers for his starvation study. He pitched the study as one that would appeal to the greater good, quote unquote, which no doubt helped his recruitment with all of these pacifists. He wanted to, quote, solve hunger for the good of democracy, end quote.
Yeah. Solve hunger for the good of democracy.
Yes.
How is he so in hunger by doing this?
It's very 1940s, let's be honest.
Oh, yeah. Like, it's like, when they are recruiting for war, like, go on a holiday.
Exactly.
Do you want to see the world?
Exactly. Yeah. So there was a lot of propaganda that was, put out for this. It was, let me find the actual quote. Will you starve so others are better fed? Was the recruitment call.
Holy shit. Anyway, okay, continue.
So let's look at the design for the study itself. It was outlined as a year-long study. So again, I'll touch on this later, but again, this is one of the reasons why it could never happen again. It was getting a whole bunch of unpaid people to starve for a year. Well, not starve, like I said, I'll get into it, but be part of a study for a year where they would have to live in the lab. So you just couldn't do that these days.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the first phase would last 3 months, and that was called the standardization or control phase. Obviously, every experiment needs a control. So subjects would be brought up to a, quote, normal weight, end quote, and build and establish a baseline. And it would aim to establish their caloric needs to maintain their weight while maintaining a constant activity level.
Okay.
To which I ask, okay, what does that mean? Like, how much of a control is this? Does that mean they were taking people who weren't active and then making them active? Does that affect their physiology? But again, there wasn't information on that, so...
Yeah, I was going to say, I have questions there, but
yes.
Okay, yeah, all right.
Yeah, I mean, that would technically impact their baseline, but again, I'm not skilled enough to go full methodology queen on this, but yeah.
You could hypothesize, right? Yeah.
Lastly, it would establish baselines for the series of psychological and physical tests that the subjects would continue throughout the various phases, and I'll go into what those tests were. The second phase had a 6-month duration, and this was the semi-starvation period. Each of the subjects' diets would be cut in half, and the main goal was them to drop their weight by 25%. Immediate yikes. And
Whoa.
Also, I know, this is a very difficult thing to do, and also is an extremely unhealthy thing to do. But Keyes thought that it would be an achievable weight loss during the time period that they had. And he also thought that 25%, quote, wouldn't cause major harm, but would provide enough meaningful results on a physical and psychological basis, end quote. To which I say, what the fuck, Ansel? I mean, I know we're looking at this retrospectively, but Jesus. It wouldn't cause that much harm. It's fine.
I'm buckling in to see how much harm this causes.
Yeah.
I feel like we're going to learn some things here. Or Ansel is going to learn some things.
I don't think I'm spoiling anything here by saying it did cause some harm.
His hypothesis was proven otherwise.
Yes. So again, the ultimate goal of this phase was to form, quote, a complete catalogue of quantifiable change that occurred in a famished being, end quote. So
right.
he wanted to just mimic the effects of famine and, create a starving person. Essentially, that was the goal of this particular phase.
And because there's still, if my math serves me well, which my math really doesn't very often serve me well, that's up to, because it's a 12-month study, yes. That's up to 9 months, yes?
Correct.
So there's still 3-month phase to go.
The third but not yet final stage of the study was the rehabilitation phase, which, correct, would last 3 months. So the goal of this stage was to evaluate recovery. And this recovery phase would be broken into groups to test recovery on a variety of diets and varying amounts of calories, proteins, and vitamins. There was a fourth stage that was established at the end of the study that Keyes did not forecast as the onset of his research, but it would end up being the unrestricted rehabilitation phase as opposed to the restricted rehabilitation phase. It would only include a smaller group of subjects, but more on that later.
Yeah, interesting.
The main thing to remember, and I think this is where a lot of the misconception about this study comes from, was that the overall aim of the study was not to learn how to starve people, but how to rehabilitate them.
Yeah, okay.
So it's all about how do we refeed starving people, which is, I think, often what people forget because all you remember is all the horrific things that they experienced during the study.
Yeah.
Which, don't get me wrong, it is horrific, but the purpose of the study was to refeed them.
Yeah, and yes, I'm getting a kind of undertone of he didn't expect the second phase to go the way that it went. I'm getting kind of an idea that perhaps he was thinking the third stage he could very much rehabilitate these people, because in the second stage they wouldn't be like too far gone almost.
But also he needed to create,
Yeah.
because you couldn't just, for example, take people who were experiencing famine and put them into a lab setting and rehabilitate them. He needed to do a controlled starvation in order to learn how to refeed them. So I get why he did it.
Yeah.
But also, could you not?
It makes sense. Yes. I mean, it's fucked, but like...
All right, let's get into the screening process because we haven't even started the actual study yet. So the screening process, more than 200 men responded for Key's first call for volunteers. The elephant in the room, which you very much established at the start. Yes, the study only included men. Of course, this was due to the nature of the civilian public service. Only men were required for conscription, but still. Given the prime opportunity of the study, aka the likelihood that this wouldn't be able to happen again, which I'm sure he thought at the time was purely because, oh, well, I've got all these people right now and I don't have to pay them. That's probably what he was thinking.
Correct.
Rather than the actual horrific ethical dilemmas here.
Yeah, I doubt the ethical side of things was really going to be the thing that led him there.
Funnily enough, and I wasn't going to put this in here, but you saying this kind of makes me think I should, was that there was actually at the time no guidance or guidelines or laws or anything around human studies. It was literally just he had his own ethical standard, like informing them of the risks and things like this, which again, we'll get into. But
he kind of develops that himself.
Yeah, he was bound by his own personal ethics. Again, this is also at the time where the atrocities of Nuremberg and Unit 731 in Japan, so where they were horrific human experiments. So,
yeah,
I mean, we're thankful that Ansel Keys put some kind of personal ethics around it, but I mean, I'm not comparing the two of this study and those historical events, but I'm just saying these were all happening at the same time.
Yeah, so yeah. You have a spectrum there. Yeah.
So Keyes put them through a rigorous screening process, a lot of which is a bit gnarly by modern standards, but here we go. So the first was, quote, men whose weight varied greatly from the norm were dismissed, end quote, aka I read that as fat people weren't included.
I was going to say.
So yeah, thanks, Ansel.
Yeah.
Married men were also excluded. The theory here was that, quote, married life inevitably interfered with the maintenance of controlled conditions, end quote. All those silly women interfering.
I mean, initially when you said, I'm like, oh, well, that's, nice because it's a bit cruel to like pull them out of the family home for, a year. But I think about it, back then men weren't really helping out with the kids, were they? But they weren't in the family home, were they? Oh, yeah, because they were. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Yep. Good point. Scrap that. Bloody women.
I mean, obviously, I'm sure that there were people who were in same-sex relationships at the time, but they probably weren't married, given it was the 1940s and 50s. And I don't
very much hidden, right?
Yes, very much so. Mm-hmm. But anyway, pesky partners, don't need them. Good physical health was one of the broader requirements.
Whatever that means. Mm-hmm.
Whatever that means. I think we know what it means, but you know what I mean.
Yep.
Quote, sound mental health, end quote, was a more elusive criteria. To determine this, Keyes actually administered the MMPI test, which was a relatively new clinical tool at the time. It was established in 1943 and is actually still used today. So it was the MMPI test stands for the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory.
Oh.
Yeah, and it's regarded as one of the most commonly used psychological tests in the world, according to Healthline.
I've never heard of it.
I know. It was developed by a clinical psychologist and a neuropsychiatrist from, you guessed it, the University of Minnesota. And it was created to be a tool for mental health professionals to help diagnose mental health disorders. It was published, like I said, in 1943, and the test has actually been updated several times in an attempt to eliminate racial and gender bias to make it more accurate, which we stan.
Well, that's nice.
Now this updated test, which is known as the MMPI-2 test, has been adapted for use in over 40 countries. So, fun fact.
Interesting. I'll have to, yeah, righto. I'll have to
The
look into that one a
original,
bit more.
yeah, the original MMPI, which is used in this instance, involved the subject being given a stack of 550 cards. Each card had a statement on it that says things such as, I am happy most of the time, or I care about what others think of me. And then the subjects would place the card onto one of three piles, true, false, or cannot say.
Okay.
Which I think is quite similar to a lot of the tests that we get today.
Very, very similar. Yeah.
Yeah. The results from each of the volunteers were compared to those who were suffering from a range of psychiatric conditions such as, and I quote, hypochondria, depression, schizophrenia, and paranoia, end quote.
Okay.
Ultimately, it wasn't a diagnostic tool, but more of a screening process in this case. And then this MMPI test was just used as a screening tool, but they also used it throughout the study across all the phases. And this would be a test that would measure the changes that starvation had on things such as anxiety, depression, obsessiveness, anger, and self-esteem.
Right.
Yeah.
Sounds similar to the DAS-21, doesn't it?
Yes, that's what I was thinking about. The third screening process was if the subjects demonstrated the ability to get along with others under, quote, trying conditions. You can say that again. Keyes wanted thick-skinned and strong-willed individuals, one that weren't short-tempered. Yeah. I would love to know what tools and diagnostic tools he used to determine this, but I couldn't exactly find what that was.
Okay.
The final criteria was finding men who had a genuine interest in relief and rehabilitation. And I don't think you'd be hard-pressed to find these type of men among the COs of the CPS, but he wanted to pick subjects that had, quote, a personal sense of responsibility in bettering the nutritional status of famine victims, end quote.
So social justice-y.
Just want to help people, that's fine.
That's nice. Good on them.
Out of all of the recruits, so over 200 people, only 40 men were deemed to meet all of Keyes' requirements. And then they were brought to Minneapolis for the final screening. And this final screening was whittled down to a list of 36 COs who would go down in history as the subjects of this historic clinical trial. Now, like I mentioned before, Keyes did caution all the men on the potential dangers that the study may place upon the subjects, but no one really knew what those dangers were. I think they had like general idea, but not specifics, because a lot of the specifics they did find out by doing this experiment. So I'm going to play the hits in terms of average heights, weights, and general demographics of the COs. So if you want to bypass numbers, feel free to skip ahead now. The 36 men on average were 25 and a half years old, the youngest being 20 and the oldest was 33.
Okay.
Which actually is interesting because most human brains aren't fully formed until they're in their mid-20s. Isn't that right?
Let me tell you, when is the men's brain? When does the male brain work? 25.
25. Okay, well, there you go. So
25 years of age. Which
I do find interesting. Again, I can't comment on the effects that would have on them, but you know, it is interesting that you're using people who are men who are so young.
Well, 20 years old.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
They weighed an average of 152.7 pounds or 69.2 kilos and had an average height of 5 foot 10 inches or 177.8 centimeters, which is kind of light as hell.
I was going to say, that's what was going through my head. I mean, that's less than Drew and taller than Drew.
Yeah, it's yeah. The heaviest, I'm just going to leave that there. The heaviest man was 183.9 pounds or 83 kilos. And the lightest was 136.4 pounds or 63 kilos.
What?
Yeah. So that's real small.
That's
yeah.
Healthy?
Apparently.
Anyway, okay.
They had an average of 14% body fat, or what equates to 21.6 pounds or 9 kilograms of body fat.
That's, yeah.
literally the next point in my notes is that is bloody small by today's standard. And even in the 1943, 1944 standards, the men were considered smaller than the average American of the time. So that's fun. It's like, so you're
Cool.
taking
We're
people
starting at a very healthy level then.
yes, a very normal average representation.
Yeah, representing a good population there. Awesome. Cool.
Yeah.
Health.
Health. Yay. Every subject had at least 1 year of college under their belts, and 18 of the 36 of them had college degrees. Each of the volunteers undertook Thorndike CAVD tests, which stands for Comprehension, Arithmetic, Vocabulary, and Direction, and was intended to measure intellectual levels on an absolute scale, whatever that means. The men took an early IQ test, which we all know is super accurate, and all the men were all intellectually above average. So this gives you the general idea of the state of the cohort. And I feel it is important for your context that, yes, this study is very much based on the effects of well-educated, white, privileged, thin men, very 1940s.
Yes. Yeah. No, you've painted that well.
Yes. So as we move forward, let's keep the demographic of these men in mind. But again, we're here to talk about the study as it is. This is all we've got to work with. So let's have a look at it.
Yeah, it's good to paint a good picture.
All right, now that we're like over half an hour into this episode, the study can begin, right?
All of that was super important though. It's good
Yes,
context,
good
good
context.
painting the picture. Yeah, we've set it up well.
You can see why this is going to be 2 parts.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So the study commenced on the 19th of November, 1944.
Okay.
And the testing would take place in the Laboratory of Physiological Hygiene, which was located under the Memorial Stadium on campus at the University of Minnesota. So it was an underground lab, and it would be home for all the 36 COs for the next year.
Oh.
Yeah, they would eat and live communally and live as test subjects. So before we launch into the control phase, I'm going to send you Key's opening speech that he gave the men at the beginning of the trial.
Perfect.
So read this into your microphone. I just sent it to you. It was long, so I trimmed it down, some of it, but you get the gist. And this is from Todd Tucker's book.
Quote, "We are here because of the problem of relief feeding in general, and particularly in the war-devastated areas today. Accurate scientific data on the effects of starvation is almost completely lacking, and until that data can be supplied, no really efficient program of relief can be planned or operated. At what levels of feeding calories, proteins, and vitamins is rehabilitation most rapid and most efficient? What are the particular areas of human function most affected? The answer to these and a host of more detailed technical questions must be provided if the most effective use is to be made of any resources for relief, no matter how small or how large. Direct observations of famine victims in the field do not supply answers because the necessary information on their pre-famine status is lacking and because field conditions are unsuitable for the collection of sufficiently exact information. It is fortunate that it was possible to establish this control project which bids fair, if not to yield all the answers, at least to greatly reduce the area of our ignorance on the questions of vital human interest. Starvation is quantitative and must be met with quantitative answers. We have joined in a common effort to supply basic knowledge on how to achieve the highest food relief with fixed and obviously inadequate food resources. If our results allow an increase in efficiency of relief feeding by as little as 5%, we shall be able to reduce the sum of starvation suffering by an incalculable greater amount that would be possible with the same effort and expenditure on direct relief. And this gain is not limited to this year. It would extend to all time and all future food crises." End quote. Wow.
Super inspiring stuff, hey?
He is just a ball of personality.
So this is essentially the goal and purpose of the whole study that was delivered to the subjects all in Key's own words. So it was all about finding a way to refeed the masses. There isn't information there, so it's up to us to do it.
Wow.
So super inspired.
Yeah.
And just like that, the study began. So now, the control period. Now we're finally doing it.
We're up to the first 6 months.
I know. First 12 weeks, so 3 months.
Oh, yes, that's right. Yes, sorry.
You're all good. As I mentioned earlier, the aim of the control period was to study the men at a baseline, but not just in regards to weight, but in terms of many other things too.
Okay.
They wanted to find the caloric break-even point, so determining the caloric intake for each of the men to maintain their weights, keep it stable, and this was obviously different for each of the subjects.
Mm-hmm.
They measured many other things as well, such as pulse rate, heart size, total blood volume, hearing, vision, basal metabolic rate, strength, and even sperm count. He wanted to be thorough.
Oh,
Yes.
okay.
As I touched on earlier, they measured their psychological states using the MMPI test, and they also established their baseline for cardiovascular and aerobic fitness, and this was done by the Harvard Physical Fitness Test. And this ended up being something that the subjects grew to dread, and I do not blame them. So the test consisted of a 20-minute treadmill walk at a steady pace of 3.5 miles per hour or 5.6 kilometers per hour, followed by a sprint at 7 miles per hour or 11 kilometers per hour for 5 minutes or until the subject collapsed.
Whoa.
I know. So this test was done twice during the control test, done once again halfway through the starvation phase, and then once more at the end of the starvation phase. But I will get to the effects of that a little bit later. So along with speed, endurance, and agility, he also measured their strength, and he did this with a backlift dynamometer, which measured your back and leg strength. So you stand on a metal plate that has this handlebar, which is attached to a chain, and it was also had a gauge on it. So you would stand over it, pull the handle as if you were performing a deadlift movement. So,
Right,
but
okay.
obviously you wouldn't be lifting anything up. It's just be measuring your pull and lift strength.
Like on a, okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
When it came to weight loss predictions, Keyes had a particular expectation on the rate at which the weight would drop off. And it is pretty much what you'd expect. It was a steady linear decline that he would plot their weights against, and he used that predictive curve as they went. But I'll get into that a little bit later because, as we all know, not everyone follows that predictive curve, but more on that later. So now in terms of caloric intake and establishing every subject's baseline, the diet was closely monitored and they could only eat the food that was provided in the lab. Every single thing that the men ate was weighed within a fraction of a gram. Now, I'm going to mention the average number of calories that the men were on as a baseline in case anyone wants to skip ahead. So the diet consisted of 3 meals a day and totaled an average of 3,200 calories. Of course, it did vary based on the men's needs. So that was an average. But the diet consisted of food that was approximate to the average American consumption of the time. But many men said that they had never eaten so well in their lives, which is unfortunate foreshadowing right there.
Yeah. God. Yeah. We're going to crush your dreams.
Now, I should flag that obviously this is a control period and a controlled trial environment. So there was nothing normal about these controlled portions, weighing your food, only being able to eat the food that you're provided. And I understand that, they weren't doing intuitive eating here, but, and I also don't think that they were trying to mimic real life or normal by any standards here. But given what we know now, obviously 2023 lens here, I would love to go back in time and look at any psychological factors that could have even begun at the start of the control period, because you're putting all of this focus on food. You're being so much more mindful on it. And I'm sure probably more than they've ever had before.
Yeah.
And as you know, as soon as you have that hyperfixation on food, it can change your behavior and perception of it a little bit. So I don't know, that would be really interesting to examine now. But this is, of course, 2023, Ash, looking back on 1944. So we love a bit of hindsight.
Yes, well, bit different. No, and you said, it's the best they've ever eaten. So like you're making their everyday focused on their diet and then exercise as well and like testing.
Exactly.
So it's creating very much a hyperfixation there.
Yeah. So in terms of movement and activity levels, on top of the food monitoring, Keyes wanted all the men to have and maintain high levels of activity throughout the experiment. So throughout all of the phases, they were required to walk 22 miles or 35 kilometers per week. So putting that into context though, When I first thought of that, I'm like, oh my God, that's so much. But if you were to walk 10,000 steps per day, that's about 8 kilometers a day. So you were kind of, if you were hitting that every day, you would get to that target. Of course, that is very ableist of me to assume that everyone can walk 10,000 steps a day. But I'm in terms of like breaking that down.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you think of modern day, the disgusting kind of diet culture recommendation would be, isn't it 20,000 steps?
No, it's 10.
Oh, is it 10,000?
It's still 10, yeah. But
I can't even, I'm not even joking you. I would be flat out doing 100.
Like I pretty much, because I walk, this is a side anecdote of my life, I walk to the train station and back when I go to work 3 days a week, but on the other 2 days I'm not doing anywhere close to that. So yeah.
Well, it's funny if you think of modern day, like a lot of people, I work from home, so I have no reason to be walking anywhere, and I don't like walking, so I'm not just going to go for a walk. So
Exactly.
it's interesting. Okay.
Yeah. But of course this is still a lot, even throughout especially during the starvation phase. So it's a bit gross.
Oh yeah.
So this 22 miles was in addition to treadmill time, quote unquote, in the lab. So it's all a bit intense.
Wow. Okay.
And alongside this exercise requirement, the volunteers were all assigned jobs within the lab, and they were required to work 15 hours a week. So these jobs were things like maintenance, laundry. Anyone with a specific scientific background were given tasks such as data tabulation or blood sample analysis and things like that. In addition to these jobs, as well as the exercise and all of that, Keyes also scheduled 25 hours a week of classes such as language, sociology, and political science. So the men were busy.
Jesus.
But outside of this, they were able to use whatever free time for themselves. And this was pretty much the same all throughout the study. At the beginning of the study, they were allowed to move freely and independently. However, that was going to change, but more on that later.
Okay.
Last thing to mention was that Ansel Keys also asked the COs to keep a journal throughout the entire experiment so that the scientists could track their thoughts, dreams, and gain insight into generally how they were all feeling. So the control period ended on the 11th of February, 1945. And at this stage, the COs were consuming an average, just general numbers warning here, skip ahead, 3,210 calories per day.
Okay.
But that was all about to change, because on the 12th of February 1945, the starvation phase began. To which I say, hard pass. Thanks, Ansel.
Oh, can I tap out here? I'm good, thank you.
Yeah. So I've been saying starvation phase. It was actually called the semi-starvation phase technically, because they were not just depriving them completely of food. In fact, Keyes wanted to recreate a food situation that had occurred in many instances of famine during the war, where an area was taken over by an enemy and pretty much overnight the food intake was reduced instantly.
Okay.
So again, rattling off some quick numbers here. So overnight, the men's calories were cut in half to an average of 1,560 calories. Oof. Like the control, each man would be on a different amount, but it was half of what they were on before. And here is where we can talk about, modern diets, right, are marketed as far less than this. And granted, I know that this is talking to men, but I don't even think that men are still given ridiculous amounts these days. Anyway.
I mean, if we think of bodybuilding, right? And we think of the calorie, we go through the cut phase, and you're just like, what? And then the sheer volume of exercise along, 100%, 1,500 calories. When you say 1,500 calories to someone, so it'd be probably oh, okay.
Yeah,
these days, particular people, I wouldn't be. I'd be like, what the fuck? But
if someone who was recommending a diet would be like, oh, well, that's a bit much, isn't it? I'm sure you could shave a little bit. No. Oh,
I remember reading a Instagram post by they might have been a nutritionist. I don't know if they were a dietitian. Or maybe they were a dietitian. Anyway, very much a diet-related dietitian, if it was that. Basically just saying and this granted is for women, but I actually kind of reject a little bit that the narrative of women needing less than men. I just don't know where we've gotten that from, because I don't know. Anyway.
Well, because women are supposed to be smaller.
Well, and that's exactly what it is though, right?
And like it's all the gender bias there. Like, I mean,
yeah,
we're built differently. And I don't know. I think having a general amount of energy that anyone is required to have, regardless of gender, I think is gross. So
problematic, right? Like you cannot go over that number. Like, of course I'm going to hyperfixate on it. But like, I remember reading one day somebody saying there's no reason for a woman to need more than 1,200 calories. And I'm like, oh, I could think of many reasons.
Yeah, I could definitely think of a few.
Like, are you freaking serious?
Yeah. I mean, so we're looking at this on face value. You know, it's a clinical experiment that focused on starving its subjects. And it uses a higher caloric allowance that many of the diets that the diet industry is marketing to you.
Recommended to these days.
Does that not paint a sad picture of the state of the world, honestly?
Oh my God, yes.
Yeah. So they went from 3 meals a day down to 2. And their diet was based pretty much around the food available in European famine areas of the time. So it mostly included potatoes, turnips, cabbage, very small quantities of meat. Some men even claimed later that they were not even there at all because they were so small. Dark bread and macaroni. They were allowed unlimited quantities of water, which is understandable, but they were also allowed unlimited amounts of black coffee, chewing gum, and cigarettes, the quantities of which absolutely skyrocketed during the starvation phase as they were trying to achieve some level of fullness. Yeah. 2 men in particular at one stage were going through 40 packets of gum a day, which led Keyes to put a limit on just 2 packets a day. And
my God.
I know. And when tea and coffee consumption went up to an average of 15 cups a day, Keyes put a limit on 9 cups a day.
Oh my God.
And I'm assuming that this was black coffee and black tea because there's no way that Keyes would have allowed any kind of milk in that whatsoever.
Milk or sugar or, oh my God.
Yeah. And I do find it quite funny that he was so meticulous in terms of tracking everything to the last gram, but he just let them have free reign when it came to stuff like this, especially because now we know a lot of the appetite suppressions that, you know, cigarettes particularly can cause, and also the vitamin deficiencies that they can cause. But again, this is 2023 looking back on 1944. So
plus though, like the impact that it's going to have on your anxiety, your like mental health, but also your stomach. Imagine 40 packs of gum a day on your stomach. Wow. Okay.
So each subject had a weight goal that ranged between 19 and 28%. So they had to lose that percentage. But of course, they took into consideration things like body fat percentage, build, age, and body weight. But this weight loss, again, was measured against that predictive curve.
Wow.
Which, of course, always works in a totally linear way. Wrong, just in case anyone didn't catch my sarcasm. And of course, they found this out. 2 of the men, in fact, they were the biggest subjects. James Plower and Bob Willoughby. Those are the two men. And they lost weight the slowest, to the point where, of course, Keyes interrogated both of them, and he believed that they were cheating, quote unquote. I hate that word, but you know, they swore that they weren't, but they weren't believed because the numbers don't lie, right?
Oh my God! Wow.
I'll get into more of that later in
okay, cool.
I think at the end of this, that's kind of where,
because that triggers things within me with like modern day eating disorder treatment. Anyway, cool. Great.
Yeah. Just hold on to that.
Okay, cool.
Ultimately, they were given the least amount of food rations in the end, to the point where they were both on between, and numbers here, 1,100 to 1,200 calories, which while the average was, as we said, 1,500. And when their weights continued to both slow after that, they were dropped even further to below 1,000 calories by the end of the starvation period.
Oh my God.
Yep. So as I mentioned before, the COs were required to maintain their activity levels of 22 miles a week of walking and attend all the classes that he said are sent for them, doing their assigned jobs and experiment tests. So only their diets changed. Everything else was the same.
Wow.
So I want to put into context here as well in terms of where we're at in terms of the war and what's happening, because as we remember from the riveting speech that you read into our microphone, the experiment was conducted in order to figure out how to feed the starving and malnourished masses that the war was going to create. So the semi-starvation phase would last 24 weeks or around 6 months. So starting at the 12th of February and concluded on the 29th of July, 1945.
Okay.
So in the 8th week of the semi-starvation phase, which was the 11th of April, 1945, the death camp at Buchenwald, Germany, was liberated by US forces, and the atrocities of the camps and the Nazi regime was starting to come to light for the first time publicly.
Okay.
And this was the first time that people saw the true devastation and the starvation inflicted upon victims during the war. And this acted as a great motivator for Keyes and the men in the study, as it reminded them of the good that they were doing. But of course, they're battling their own hunger and the effects of which I will go into shortly. But kind of that added as a little bit of a motivator for them in a horrific way.
How nice, yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
So 5 weeks after that, during the 13th week of starvation, the war in Europe ended. So that was on the 8th of May, 1945. Again, I'll get into this a little bit later about Keyes was very anxious about getting the results out as soon as possible because he was worried that he was going to miss the boat of this research and the point of it. But I'll get into that a little bit later. So we're going to go into the symptoms that the men started to experience while they were in this semi-starved state. And for those who have a history of dieting, disordered eating, or any kind of eating disorder, I am sure that many of the symptoms on this list you will recognize. But I need to point out, this is not a checklist or a measure of how sick you are. This is not something that should be aimed for, nor should it ever. These are the results of an experiment of starving men. So please keep that in mind when you listen to this. And if you feel like this is going to be triggering for you, please turn off now. Please.
Yeah. And maybe add to that, this list isn't going to be something that everybody experiences as well.
Absolutely. We'll start with the physical symptoms. Their pulse rate dropped from an average of 55 beats per minute to 35 beats per minute. The lowest pulse rate was 28.
Wow.
Yeah. Their heart size shrunk by 17%. Their blood volume decreased by 10%. There was a decrease in the amount of red blood cells, which of course are used to carry oxygen around the body, so the men were very anemic. Their white blood cell count decreased by 30%, so their immune systems were a lot weaker.
Yeah.
They experienced low blood pressure, dizziness, with some experiencing momentary blackouts, especially when they stood up. So let's just make them run on a treadmill for 20 minutes.
Yeah, I was going to say. I'm sure the pass out stage, that was much quicker. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I'll get there. Their BMR, or basal metabolic rate, dropped as much as 50%.
Wow. And yet we're still running on that treadmill. Okay.
I know. The average body temperature dropped from 37 degrees Celsius, or 98.6 Fahrenheit, to 35.4 degrees, or 95.8. So quite a significant drop. They were, and as a result, they were very sensitive to the cold. Many of the men claimed that having a hot shower was the best part of their day, as it was the only time that they felt warm. Similarly, their tolerance to heat increased, and they could stand much hotter showers than the control period, and they requested their food and their plates to be like piping hot.
Interesting.
They had poor circulation, so their lips and their fingernails were often very blue. Many developed edema, particularly in their legs, to the point where it actually impacted and slowed weight loss in some of the men. They carried around pillows to sit on because they would get very uncomfortable. They had general aches and pains. They were more sensitive to bruising. Cuts took longer to heal. Their hair grew slower and began to fall out. Nails became more brittle. And men started to look, more prematurely aged. Their skin became rough and thin, muscle cramps and pains. They had dark circles under their eyes. They had very poor and interrupted sleep. They had, general fatigue and poor concentration.
My God.
They would experience frequent urination all day and night. So during the control, they would expel about 1.2 liters of urine, and that volume doubled during the semi-starvation period to 2.5 liters. And this was partly from the increased volume of liquids that they were using to fend off hunger, but also their bodies were just starting to become irregular.
Yeah, okay. I was thinking, if you're having however many 15 cups of coffee a day, then that's a diuretic, right? So
yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Similarly, they experienced constipation from lack of fiber and muscle atrophy of their digestive tracts. So it went from once a day to, on average, to once to twice a week on average. So my condolences. They also experienced just general muscle atrophy. And based on their backlift dynamometer readings, they documented a 27% reduction in strength. The average of the very dreaded the Harvard fitness test, so the treadmill one, there was an average drop of 72% in cardiovascular and aerobic fitness by the last day of the semi-starvation period. Those who made it to the sprinting portion of the test collapsed within seconds.
Oh my God.
But it's healthy, right? Weight loss.
Oh my God. 1,500 calories.
Yeah.
Oh my God. It's bringing the Biggest Loser vibes,
Right?
Very it's bringing,
So quite a list. That was just the physical side effects. I mean, look, the body is incredible with the amount of things that it will sacrifice in terms of keeping your body alive. And that's exactly what's happening here, right?
Yeah.
The body is like shutting down. It's like protein. I don't need to grow hair. I don't need to grow nails. I don't need to, all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's prioritizing.
Yeah, this is what happens to starving bodies. Your body is not supposed to be doing these things.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, so this is what happens to a starving, malnourished body. It is not normal or healthy. You should not want this at all. And if you aren't experiencing these things, that doesn't mean that you're not unwell.
Yeah, it's interesting, and we always go back to it's if we talk about eating disorders and disordered eating, it's a mental illness with sometimes physical ramifications, but It's also very interesting. I think we hear the narrative of, but my body's doing fine, my bloods are fine, my XYZ is fine, and it's like, it's like for today, because your body is doing what it can to make it fine.
Exactly.
That's not really an indication of it actually being fine.
Exactly. So I'm going to go through some behavioral effects as well. So there was an increase in obsessive behaviors. Many of the men started to develop obsessions with food. It became the only topic of conversation, the only topics that interested the men at all. They began reading cookbooks, books of like food production, and this was, among men who had previously shown no interest in these topics before starting the study.
Yeah, okay.
Many actually planned on becoming chefs or opening restaurants once the experiment was over. 5 of the men collected cookbooks and recipes to the point where one of the men had a collection of over 100 books.
Oh my God.
I know. Plate clearing and plate licking became very common as not to waste a single morsel of food. Many of them diluted their food with water, particularly the potatoes, to make, more quantities of it. Some would try and drag out the meals for as long as possible with all kinds of rituals, such as eating with a teaspoon, cutting food into small pieces and eating things one at a time, like peas or something like that. They began to over-season food quite regularly and became obsessed with adding salt. And we know that starvation obviously affects taste buds, so that's probably why. They would develop very odd food combinations and would become very irritable and hostile and preferred self-isolation at meal times. And many of them said that the time between the meals became just the biggest burden, that the time passed super slowly. So we're going to take a look at the psychological effects now, and there were plenty, as you can imagine. As early as a few weeks into the semi-starvation period, group morale had dropped significantly, and their MMPI tests reflected this as well. So this is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory test that was used to measure mood and personality. Their scores showed an increase of depression, anxiety, hypochondriasis, and hysteria across the board. 2 of the men in particular demonstrated particularly violent outbursts on the border of psychosis, but more on that later.
Okay.
There was a general loss of ambition across the board. They all acted in a more solitary way, and this was the same for people who pretty much considered themselves extroverts before they started the experiment. There was a loss of sense of humor, reduced alertness, impaired judgment, concentration, and decision-making, feelings of inadequacy, neglect of personal hygiene. Some people became very fascinated with their own bodily functions, particularly the parts involving digestion. There was an apathy to activities in general. Sex drive was one of the first things to drop off, and it did significantly. There was a drop in the interest of the opposite sex, but of course we're assuming that they were all straight, or at least Keyes did. But the drive for food obviously soared in terms of, they completely switched.
Yeah, okay.
They became less interested in the world events and in the war particularly, which was quite a large change, compared to the start of the experiment and given the group that it was. Yeah. For example, on the day that Germany surrendered, there was not a single mention of it in any of the men's journals.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Especially when you consider they used that as a motivation for them back.
Exactly.
Not very that. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Not surprising.
No, exactly. Not surprising. Many of the men found sticking to the regime more and more difficult, to the point where a buddy system had to be introduced in 9 weeks into the starvation period. And this was done not just so that the men could be monitored, but also to ensure the men's safety. And there was a particular event that caused the buddy system to be implemented, but I'll circle back to that in a bit.
Okay.
Many of the men found that they couldn't stand watching other people, mainly those outside of the experiment, eating food. One of the men, Henry Schulberg, was watching a movie and found himself completely unable to concentrate in the film due to the crunching of the popcorn around him, but he also only found himself interested in the scenes where the characters were eating. There were other people who also experienced high levels of distress when they saw people wasting food, including one man who ran after a woman at a cafe who left her food, like half her food on her plate, and he verbally accosted her on the street. So they're not coping. Put it that way.
Wow. Yeah. How did they stop? So if they're allowed out to like a cafe, like they see it out and about, or like at the movie theater or whatever, how were they stopped from, say, like, I don't know, eating the popcorn or eating that woman's food that she left behind on her plate? Like, how did they stop that?
Well, I'll get into it.
Okay, all right.
There were some people who didn't, and that's why the buddy system was introduced, so that they could have this honor system of watching each other.
Oh.
Yeah. There were other people who also took, vicarious pleasure out of watching people eat. So they would just sit and people watch for hours, just watch other people eat and find joy out of watching others do that.
Wow.
There were dreams about forbidden foods, quote unquote, that would then cause the men to wake up feeling guilty. However, some of those dreams became a lot more troublesome than just dreaming of food they weren't allowed. So quite early into the starvation period, one of the particularly troubled subjects, Franklin Watkins, or subject number 234, began having some particularly harrowing and recurring nightmares about cannibalism.
Oh.
Yes. He struggled with the experiment from the very beginning, as early as a few days in. And interviews with Watkins that were documented in Todd Tucker's book that I mentioned at the start claimed that it wasn't just the lack of food, but the very strict regime that, quote, made him unhinged, unquote. He began to cheat. Again, I hate that word in terms of what it means, but in this context, he began eating large amounts of food that were not part of the experiment, and when he was out of the lab alone.
Right.
He ended up confessing this to Keyes when Watkins was questioned by him after his weight veered steeply from the predictive curve, and he admitted that he felt, real guilt and shame and a sense of failure. However, he did find himself continuing these binging behaviors when he was out alone. He turned over all of his money to the lab staff, but that led him to actually shoplift food and eat that.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. It was because of Watkins actually that in the 9th week out of the 24 weeks, Keyes implemented that buddy system. So none of the men were allowed to leave the lab unaccompanied, and there were no exceptions for classes, dating, study, anything.
Wow.
So psychologically, Watkins was not faring very well. He was having regular violent outbursts, one instance where he actually threatened to kill Ansel Keyes. And his MMPI score showed high levels of psychosis. So it was at this point, in fact, it was 3 days after the implementation of the buddy system that he was removed and released from the experiment.
Wow. Isn't it interesting? Because a lot of research at the moment is actually looking at the psychotic component of eating disorders. I was actually involved in one study recently, and one of the questions was actually, what would you relate, if there was another psychiatric illness that you would relate an eating disorder to, what would it be? And I was like, oh, psychosis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
interesting.
Absolutely.
Cool.
He went into a, quote, mental institution, end quote, and within days of eating regular meals, all his signs of psychosis disappeared.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Go figure. Okay, cool.
He was the first subject to be released, but he would not be the last.
Yeah, okay.
So I think you can kind of get the gist of how bad things were getting here. So aside from this one subject being removed, the experiment was actually tracking very well, according to Keyes, but morale was very low. Shocker, starving people do that. So in the 15th week of starvation, so just over halfway through the semi-starvation phase. So I realize I'm saying starvation and semi-starvation interchangeably. I mean it to mean the same thing. It's just...
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
I just realised that. So about halfway through, he arranged for the men to have a relief meal. So So he allowed the COs to pick what would be on the menu, but of course every single part of the meal was measured very carefully and reduced to be within what Keyes thought was a, quote, reasonable number of calories, proteins and vitamins. End
It
quote.
gives very... We'll go like circle back around to bodybuilding vibes,
Cheat meal?
doesn't it?
Cheat day?
Cheat meal, yeah, doesn't it? Because it's like they pick, whatever it is, but it's got to be, it's just the one meal. Yeah.
If it fits my macros.
Yeah.
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 And they like lead their entire week up to it.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
So the COs were very happy with this meal, and immediately the mood picked up around the dining room. Men were laughing and joking with each other, which had essentially all but disappeared during the semi-starvation period. And not a single crumb was left over. The men even ate the peel off the oranges, which actually pissed off Ansel Keys because he hadn't accounted for it in terms of the calories, which A, shows how meticulous he was, but B, chill the frick out.
Yeah, it's
dude.
a peel. And also like, bleh.
Actually, I have, if it's like a slice, sometimes I will eat the orange peel. It's quite nice.
The orange peel.
Yeah, if it's like a little slice, like of, not like a whole wedge, but like if it's like on the side of a drink or something.
Oh, I've never done it. I've always just like,
it's quite nice.
I'm a kiwi peel eater, but not a...
What?
Yeah. What do you mean what? So you're meant to eat it. It's good fiber.
What? Eat the peel of the kiwi fruit? Like, what, do you just bite into it like an apple?
Like an apple, yeah. I would just
monster.
I just cut the ends off and then you munch into it. Yeah. Try it. Especially the gold kiwis. If you've never eaten a kiwi peel, you start with the gold kiwis and then you transition into the green kiwi. It's fine.
There's a divide in the room. I'm feeling it.
It's just like it's nothing. It's just, and like how inconvenient is eating a
very,
kiwi?
though.
Yeah, but like you don't really like, you give it a wash, it's fine. Because like how inconvenient is cutting in half a kiwi?
You chop it in half and you eat this, like a little
Yeah, that's
boiled
so
egg.
annoying. It's annoying.
No,
it's
like
messy.
No.
It's messy. It's annoying. Like how? Then what do I do with the skin?
We're gonna have to agree to disagree here.
Nah. Eat the kiwi
No,
skin.
I don't agree to that.
I'm not. I'm not agreeing to disagree. It's the best. It's good fiber.
Okay.
So much more convenient. Like when you're driving, you can just eat it.
Anyway, so we are well over halfway now, and it was at this stage that the men became more unpredictable mentally, and this is where a lot of the men began to show signs of psychological symptoms that I mentioned earlier. So this is also when the second subject was released from the experiment. Also for, it all stemmed from his weight veering from the curve and admissions to cheating, quote unquote. Earl Wagant was working in a grocery store at the start of the experiment, and there were points where he started to experience blackouts, and then when he came to, he would be eating. So he then started to eat food being marked to be thrown out, and once he eventually left that job, he began eating things out of the garbage. So he felt extreme guilt and shame because of this, and he had to be closely monitored, and his mental health really deteriorated. But he wasn't released because of that. What triggered his release was that they started to notice blood in his urine. And it was at that point, which was at week 18 in the semi-starvation phase, that he was released.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And of course, he goes into hospital within a few days of proper meals,
He's good again.
blood goes away.
Interesting that. Hey.
There were 2 other subjects who completed the starvation part of the experiment, but their data was actually not used in the final study. And they just happened to be the 2 biggest men that were in the study, the 2 jocks, quote unquote. Yeah. So the third person to be removed from the study was a man called James Plower. And he also only admitted to cheating right at the very end of the semi-starvation phase. And he said that he was eating food that he found on the ground as well as out of the garbage. So once he was expelled from the experiment, he actually checked himself into a psychiatric facility as he was experiencing high levels of neuroses, indecisiveness, guilt, poor self-worth, and restlessness.
Oh my God.
So the last person to be expelled from the experiment was actually Plower's mate, Bob Willoughby. Which I mentioned before. Those 2 are the ones who were eating 40 packets of gum a day. So Bob Willoughby was his buddy for the large portion of the study, and they both bonded over being the largest men and, as a result, the lowest amount of food that they were given. In fact, Willoughby was actually on the lowest rations out of all of the men.
Oh my God.
And after Ansel Keys found out about Plower cheating, Keys interrogated Willoughby, not just because he was friends with Plower, but because also his weight had not budged, and Keys thought that Willoughby must have been cheating too. And this is something that Willoughby has categorically, unequivocally denied right to the very end, still like all the way through. He said, "I never cheated. I stuck right to it. I was actually really proud of myself that I stuck to it." But he wasn't losing weight, so obviously he must have been cheating. So as a result, instead of believing Willoughby, Keys just didn't use any of his data in the final study, which is baffling because wasn't this entire study about rehabilitation rather than starving people? But studies, of course, have outliers, but not, because not all bodies react the same way. In fact, I think that Keys should have looked at this as perhaps an opportunity to explore the option that maybe bigger bodies hold on to weight in different ways. But that was just never going to happen, now was it?
All bodies work the same.
Please excuse the whippersnipper weed whacker in the background of Kelly's microphone. He also didn't omit the data of those men who lost more than he expected, but he still, there are still 2 other whole phases, so I won't get on my soapbox right now because we'll be here a while. So the semi-starvation phase ended on July 28th, 1945. I'm going to do some final numbers here, so skip ahead if you need to. By the end of the 24-week period, the average weight had dropped from 152.7 pounds or 69 kilos to 115.6 pounds or 52 kilos, which was a drop of 24.29%.
Oh my God.
I know. They had lost an average of 1/3 of a centimetre in height. Their average blood volume had dropped by 500 cubic centimetres, and their heart size had reduced by 17%.
Wow.
32 men proceeded to the final official phase, which was called restricted rehabilitation. And that is where I'm leaving us for part 1.
Oh my God. I am really excited to hear it. Because I think, as we kind of said at the beginning, it's interesting if you think of this in the context of eating disorders and you think of this in the context of those who do have a restrictive component and then need to be rehabilitated in a way. If you need to do that within a hospital environment, it is a controlled rehabilitation. We think of refeeding syndrome and making sure we take that slowly, and then I am very interested and very curious.
Yes. No, honestly, the restricted rehabilitation phase was almost like the most interesting to me because it's obviously informing everything that we know, right? So stick around for part 2 because that's going to be very interesting.
I'll be there.
Good. I just want to, before I go into the last housekeeping of all of this, if any of the information in this episode has been triggering or troubling for you, please reach out for help. There's a bunch of resources in the description below, but also on our website. So please go if you're feeling unsafe or really triggered by this. Please seek help. I'm hoping that if you were particularly triggered by it, you didn't make it this far, because hopefully I put enough trigger warnings in there. But
Yeah.
some of us never really know how you can react to these sort of things if you hear it. So please take care of yourself.
Yes. Exactly right.
But thanks for listening to me talk about this, because like I said, I'm super interested in this, and I think, the next episode is going to be really, really interesting. And I'm definitely going to circle back and have a look at how we can compare the two between the effects of starvation and those of eating disorders. So watch this space, because all of this is very relevant.
I will be. I'm very excited.
That's all for today's podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Also, if you feel like leaving us a cheeky review or a little rating, we'd love that. Thank you. It helps our podcast so much and our little analytics. We've had an amazing response so far, so we're really keen to keep growing. And if anyone out there is listening and is interested in potentially being a guest, you can reach out, because we always are in the looking out for fun guests or even topics. You can follow us on Instagram at pavewithgoldpod, or send us a Gmail at pavewithgoldpod@gmail.com. Those are the best places to send us any sort of topics or anything like that. Or you can visit our website, pavewithgoldpodcast.com. All of those links, as always, will be in the show notes along with those extra resources. And until next time, stay safe, and we'll talk to you again soon. Bye.
Bye.
This podcast is general in nature and has not taken your personal circumstances or medical history into account. We are here to share our own experiences and the things that we have found helpful throughout our own personal recovery journeys. Please remember that each person's journey and circumstances are different, and not all of the information contained in this podcast may be relatable to you. It's important you consult your own GP or recovery team to seek out tailored advice before making any important decisions relating to your own health and recovery process. If you have found any of the content in this episode distressing, please contact your care team or a medical professional. If you or someone you know is in crisis and needs help now, please contact emergency services in your region immediately.